So here I have exercise 2 and exercise 3 from your homework. And you'll notice that there are a lot of chromatic notes, like the C sharp, this F sharp, this A sharp. These all don't fit into the key by default. Now, these chromatic notes can actually function in one of 3 different ways. Well, in the first example, in exercise 2, we're actually in D minor. So this C sharp actually functions as the raised leading tone, basically. And so the C sharp is basically a tone in the D harmonic minor scale. So it's just the leading tone. You could also have these chromatic notes function as part of secondary dominant chords or as secondary diminished chords. There are other situations where notes in the exercises are not necessarily chromatic to the key, but they can still function as secondary dominant chords or secondary diminished chords. So that's something that's important to realize. That's what these asterisks mean. So basically, you want to employ secondary dominant or secondary diminished chords at these moments, even though these notes right here, some of them, are all in the key. Okay? Now, here's the thing. Let's actually try to figure out this exercise. So right here, this C sharp is actually part of the key that we're in the sense that it functions as the leading tone of D minor. So I'm just going to fill in some counterpoint right here. And what I get here is basically a 5, 6, 4, right? Great. The next one is this. I'm just going to fill this in. It seems to work. It's basically a 1, 6. You know, you could do it in multiple different ways, but this is just something that seemed to work for me. Now, here is our first chromatic note. This is interesting, right? Now, this chromatic note actually resolves down by step, which, according to the one note, if you have a chromatic note that resolves down by step, it normally functions as a 7th as part of a secondary dominant chord. Okay? So, as a result, this could be the 7th of what chord? Well, a D chord, right? Let's use a D chord right there. And a D dominant 7th chord, right? D dominant 7th chord consists of D, F sharp, A, and C. And you can clearly see that this chord is not in the key of D minor. But it is a secondary dominant in the key, meaning it is the 5th above a chord that is actually in the key. So the numerator will be a 5, 7. The denominator will be, well, the chord that is a 5th below it. And a 5th below D is G. And the G minor chord does exist in the key of D minor. And that happens to be the 4 chord. And then, correspondingly, when you have a secondary dominant chord, you want to always resolve to the chord that's conveyed in the denominator of the chord symbol. So right here, I'll have to go like this and make it so that now we have a G, which conveniently represents this 4 chord right here. Okay? So this is one example of this asterisk, right? This is chromatic. Well, it's basically the author is suggesting that you use a secondary dominant here, even though it's not chromatic to the key that we're in. Okay? So that's basically what these asterisks mean. Now, if I go back, actually, I can actually make this a little bit more elegant. Make this purely stepwise, right? Now, instead of being a 5, 7, it's a 5, what is it? 6, 5, right? It's the first inversion. Cool, right? Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so similar principle applies on exercise 3, right? So we start out with the 1 chord, Now we have some chromaticism. We have chromaticism going up, okay? So generally, if the chromaticism resolves up, the chromatic note functions as the third of the secondary dominant chord, which means that this A sharp right here, let's see if I can put it down here, this A sharp right here, create it over here, and then move this text box down here. If I can do that, it's in red. This A sharp functions generally as a third of a secondary dominant chord. A third below A sharp is, it could be F sharp, right? That could work. F sharp could be the basis of the secondary dominant chord, which, let's see, F sharp, A sharp, C sharp, E equals F sharp dominant 7, right? I guess the real thing now to test if this is actually a valid secondary dominant chord for what we're working on is the chord a fifth below this chord in the key? Well, what's a chord that's a fifth below this chord? Well, a fifth below F sharp 7 is B something, right? So let's see if there's a B chord in this example. In the key that we're in, I should say. Is there a B chord in the key that we're in? Well, we're in the key of A major, right? We're in the key of A major, which means that there actually is a B minor chord on the second scale degree, okay? So a B minor chord is second chord in key, okay? So this is all to say that I've kind of confirmed what chord this A sharp belongs to. It belongs to an F sharp 7 chord. And I have to produce a counterpoint appropriately that sort of reflects this. So a good choice that I can use is I can use the E, right? Because this E is another note that's in the F sharp 7 chord. You already have the A sharp right here. And now you conveniently kind of represent this F sharp 7 chord, right? So now if I were to write this F sharp 7 chord as secondary dominant in terms of Roman numerals, I guess this is going to be a first inversion dominant 7th chord. And it's going to be basically a 5-6-5 of 2. Because remember, B minor, the chord that it's tonicizing, the key area that's tonicizing, is the second chord in the key of A major. So ultimately, we're going to resolve to a 2 chord, right? Okay? So hopefully this all makes sense. There is some little thing that you have to be aware of, and that's with secondary diminished chords. There is a situation where I used a secondary diminished chord. And when you do employ it, you have to make sure that you don't directly resolve from like a diminished 7th or an augmented 2nd straight to a 5th, or a 4th, because they want to resolve that way. That's like the only way you can really resolve these chords, but you can't do a direct resolution like that, because in first species counterpoint, 5ths have to be preceded by 3rds or 6ths. You can't precede a 5th with a dissonant interval in first species counterpoint. So the result is you got to be careful. You can actually surround the diminished interval with extra notes, and ultimately, if you go into second species, you can now have secondary diminished chords. So if you do find yourself in a situation where you have a secondary diminished chord, just make sure that you go into second species and just flesh out the example a little more so that you don't run into this problem of resolving from a diminished 7th to a perfect 5th. Just use a buffer note like a diminished 5th and a 3rd before you actually get back to the 5th. Okay, I hope that helped, and if you have any questions, of course, just let me know and we can be in contact. Thank you so much.